The search party found him on the fourth day. Not frozen, not delirious, not huddled under a dead horse's belly, trying to hold on to a few last degrees of warmth. They found him sitting up, coat still buttoned, a small fire reduced to orange coals at his feet, inside what looked from the outside like nothing more than a crack in a mountain. The men who reached him first didn't speak for a long moment. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit the night the blizzard hit. Wind out of the northwest. 3 days of snowfall that buried the trail under 4 feet of white silence. 2 other travelers caught in the same storm hadn't made it. Their cabins were found intact. Their firewood was found untouched. The cold had simply reached through the walls and taken them anyway. But this man, caught in the open, with a broken wagon, no shelter and no time, had survived 4 nights in a mountain crevice barely wide enough to turn around in. The rescuers looked at the crack in the rock. They looked at the charred wagon boards wedged across the opening. They looked at the man. How? He didn't have more firewood. He didn't have better clothing. He hadn't found some hidden cave with a natural hot spring. What he had was a shattered axle, a canvas tarp, a folding knife, and about 40 minutes before the sky fell. And somehow that was enough. What he stumbled into, or rather, what he forced his broken wagon into, was a thermal system that the mountain had been running for 10,000 years. He didn't design it. He didn't study it. He barely understood it himself when he tried to explain it later to the men warming their hands around his dying fire. But it worked. Every cold hour of every long night, it worked. This is the story of how a man with nothing built something that shouldn't have been possible, and what the physics of stone, confinement, and a single small flame can do when desperation forces a decision that reason would never allow. If you've ever wondered what you'd do with nothing but what's around you, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Let's get into it. The Rocky Mountain fur trade routes of the 1840s were built on a brutal calculus. Move fast, move light, and never trust the sky past mid-October. Most men who traveled those high passes understood the arithmetic of risk. They knew the names of the canyons that funneled wind into something close to a weapon. They knew which ridgelines turned beautiful in the morning and deadly by noon. They had heard the stories, and most of them, if they were honest, believed the stories applied to other men. Less careful men, men who hadn't done this before. Eldon Marsh had done it before. That was the problem. Oral accounts preserved in a regional trading post-ledger from the period describe him as a man of middle years, experienced, unhurried. He had crossed the divide twice before the autumn of 1847. He knew the route. He knew the weather patterns. And on the morning, he loaded his wagon and pointed his mule northwest toward the high pass. The sky was clear, the air was cold but still, and every sign he trusted told him he had time. He had roughly 60 miles to cover. The pass crested at just over 9,200 feet. The trail dropped into a sheltered valley on the far side, where a small trading settlement offered a warm floor and a meal that wasn't jerked meat and hardtack. He had made the calculation before. A week, maybe 8 days if the mule was stubborn. The wagon was loaded with pelts, a small iron tool kit, 2 wool blankets, a coil of rope, a canvas tarp, and 3 days of provisions beyond what he expected to need. Standard frontier redundancy. Not generous, but not reckless either. The first 2 days passed without incident. The trail climbed steadily through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, the canopy thinning as elevation increased. By the second evening, the trees were shorter, the rock more exposed, and the horizon had that particular flat gray quality that experienced mountain travelers learn to read like a sentence. It didn't say storm. Not yet. It said maybe. Marsh camped at around 7,800 feet on the second night, in a shallow depression sheltered on 2 sides by stone outcroppings. He noted, according to an account relayed years later through a trapper who wintered with him in the 1850s, that the wind shifted twice during the night, first from the west, then briefly from the north. He filed away. He didn't turn back. By mid-morning of the 3rd day, the trail had narrowed to a rocky shelf barely wide enough for the wagon. On his left, a wall of fractured granite rose 15 to 20 feet. On his right, the shelf dropped away into a boulder field. The mule moved slowly. The footing was uneven, loose shale over solid rock, the kind of surface that looked stable and wasn't. It was here on this particular stretch of trail that the left rear wheel found a gap in the shale, dropped 2 inches, and threw the entire weight of the loaded wagon across the axle at the worst possible angle. The crack was audible at 50 yards, local accounts suggest. The axle broke clean. The wagon lurched. The mule stumbled, recovered, and stood still with the particular stillness of an animal that has decided it is done moving for the day. Marsh climbed down and looked at the damage. The axle was split, not bent, not cracked, but broken through. He had no spare. He had no forge. He had no settlement within 2 days of walking, and the sky to the northwest, which he now had ample time to study, had gone from flat gray to something closer to white. The wind hadn't picked up yet, but it would. He had perhaps 3 hours before the first snow, maybe 4. He looked at the broken wagon. He looked at the trail ahead. He looked at the granite wall beside him. And it was then, according to the account passed through the trading post, that he noticed something he had passed 100 times without registering. The wall wasn't solid. There is a particular quality to the silence that precedes a mountain blizzard. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of suspension, as if the air itself has stopped moving in order to gather itself for what comes next. Experienced men in the northern Rockies described it in different ways: a heaviness, a stillness, a pressure behind the eyes. Some said it smelled like iron. Others said it smelled like nothing at all, which was the absence of all the small mountain scents that normally layered the air. Eldon Marsh knew that silence. He stood beside his broken wagon at somewhere around 8,400 feet of elevation and felt it settle over him like a lid closing over a box. The mathematics were simple and merciless. Walking out was not an option. Not with the pass ahead still at 9,200 feet and the trail behind him, now a full day's journey from any structure capable of sheltering a man. A man on foot in those elevations, in a blizzard, without a known destination within reach, was a man in serious trouble. Experienced travelers of the period put the survival window for exposure at those altitudes, in those conditions, at somewhere between 8 and 16 hours without adequate shelter. Less if the wind drove the cold hard enough to overcome whatever insulation a man's clothing could offer. He had 2 wool blankets, a canvas tarp, a coat that was good, but not extraordinary. He could burn the wagon. The thought occurred to him. It occurs to every man in that situation. Stack the wood, keep the fire enormous, outlast the storm by force. But a fire in open air at altitude, in a blizzard wind, is not a heater. It is a furnace with no walls, radiating 95% of its energy into the sky, requiring constant feeding, demanding that the man tending it remain exposed to the very conditions he is trying to escape. Oral accounts from the period are full of men who burned everything they had and still didn't make it. He needed walls. He needed mass between himself and the wind. That was when the crack in the granite registered as something other than scenery. It ran vertically, roughly parallel to the trail, beginning at ground level and extending upward perhaps 12 feet before pinching closed. At its widest point, roughly chest height, it measured somewhere between 28 and 34 inches across. Enough to admit a man sideways. Enough to admit a man with his gear if that gear was reorganized. Not enough, by conventional reasoning, for a wagon. But the wagon was broken. What Marsh had was no longer a vehicle. What he had was approximately 400 pounds of pine and hardwood framing, a canvas tarp still lashed to the bows, 2 iron wheels that weren't going anywhere, and a collection of boards, struts, and braces that could, if removed with purpose, become something entirely different. He started pulling the wagon apart. The urgency was real, and the work was cold. The temperature at that elevation was already sitting at around 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind, still light but awakening, cut through his coat on every gust. He worked methodically, not frantically, because panic in that cold was expensive. Panic meant sweat. Sweat, in a situation like this, was dangerous. Wet wool loses roughly 80% of its insulating value, and a man soaked through his inner layers at 22 degrees Fahrenheit with a storm arriving is colder than a man who stayed dry and moved half as fast. He removed the canvas tarp first, folding it roughly and dragging it toward the fissure. Then the two side boards from the wagon bed. Then the front brace, a thick piece of hardwood mortised into the frame at the tongue, which took him nearly 20 minutes to free with his folding knife and a flat stone used as a makeshift mallet. The pelts came out, the tool kit, the rope, the blankets, the provisions. He sorted by importance: warmth first, fire second, food third. Then he began feeding the wider boards sideways into the crevice, angling them to clear the narrower upper sections, stacking them against the interior walls to build a floor between himself and the bare stone. Stone at altitude in winter draws heat from a sleeping man at a rate that most people profoundly underestimate. Ground cold kills quietly from below, while a man's attention is fixed on the wind above him. The floorboards went down first. That detail mattered more than he likely knew at the time. By the time the sky opened and the first serious snow began to fall, thick, wind-driven, near horizontal, Marsh had the tarp stretched across the crevice entrance, 3 crossboards wedged as a frame, and most of his gear inside. The mule, freed from the traces, had already moved 40 yards down the trail and pressed itself into a shallow notch in the rock face, doing what animals do when they know what's coming. Marsh pulled the last board across the entrance. The wind hit the tarp like a fist. It held. Inside it was dark, tight, cold, and crucially still. The blizzard was on the other side of a canvas wall, and the granite was on every other side. He didn't understand yet what that meant, but the mountain did. There's a principle in physics that most people learn and immediately forget because it seems obvious. Heat does not move toward cold. It moves away from warm. It is not a force of nature seeking to destroy you. It is simply matter trying to reach equilibrium. And in a mountain blizzard, equilibrium means death. The question of survival, reduced to its physical bones, is always the same question. Can you slow the process down long enough to outlast the event? In a conventional cabin, you answer that question with insulation, logs, chinking, packed moss, animal hides over the windows. You interrupt the conduction of heat through the walls. You create a buffer between the warm interior and the cold exterior. It works, but it requires a structure built with that purpose in mind: seasoned wood, adequate thickness, and a heat source robust enough to replace the heat constantly leaking through every joint and gap. Eldon Marsh had none of that. What he had was better, in at least one critical dimension, and he didn't know it. A granite crevice is not a cabin wall. It is not insulation. Granite conducts heat relatively poorly compared to steel or iron, but it is not a thermal barrier in the way that dry wood or packed earth can be. What granite is, in a mass thick enough to matter, is a thermal reservoir, a material with enormous capacity to absorb, hold, and slowly release energy. The rock wall surrounding Marsh was not thin. These are not slabs or ledges. This was a fracture line running through a solid granite formation, with walls extending back into the mountain by some unknown depth. Local geological surveys from the region, conducted decades later, estimated the surrounding rock mass in that area at several thousand tons. Even the directly adjacent walls, measured conservatively, represented several hundred tons of stone within 15 feet of the crevice interior. That stone had been sitting in air temperatures ranging from the low 20s to the mid-30s degree F for weeks. It was cold, but not as cold as the open air in a blizzard. Rock of that mass changes temperature slowly, far more slowly than air. While the outside air temperature plunged to 14 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind drove it toward a felt temperature well below zero, the granite walls of the crevice remained at somewhere between 28 degrees Fahrenheit and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm, but dramatically more stable than the environment outside. This difference between 14 degrees Fahrenheit outside and 28 degrees Fahrenheit inside is not trivial. It is the difference between a man who must generate enormous amounts of body heat simply to stay alive and a man who needs only to supplement a system already partially doing that work for him. But the rock was only part of it. The geometry of the crevice was the other part. And this is where what Marsh stumbled into begins to look less like luck and more like accidental engineering. A narrow vertical space, sealed at one end by canvas and board barrier, and closed at the other by solid rock, behaves differently from an open room or a tent. When a small fire is lit in that space, or when a human body at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit sits in that space, the warm air produced cannot escape easily. It rises, reaches the ceiling, and because the space is narrow and the walls are close, it encounters stone almost immediately. That stone absorbs a fraction of the heat. The air cools slightly, descends along the walls, and circulates back toward the heat source at the bottom of the space. This is thermal convection in its most basic form, the same principle that makes a well-designed masonry stove so efficient. But here, the mountain itself had provided the geometry. Marsh hadn't designed a convection loop. He had crawled inside one. His body heat alone, roughly 400 BTUs per hour at rest, more if he was moving, was enough to begin warming the air in that confined space. The granite absorbed the excess and held it. The canvas tarp, imperfect as a seal, blocked the direct wind load and prevented the cold outside air from simply flushing the interior every few minutes, which would have erased every BTU his body produced. He didn't have a thermometer, but accounts relayed later suggest that within 2 hours of sealing the entrance, he had removed one layer of clothing, not because he was warm, but because he was warmer than he expected to be. That was the first indication that something unusual was happening. The entrance seal was improvised, imperfect, and, by the standards of frontier construction, remarkably effective. Marsh worked it in stages, which was the right instinct, even if the reasoning behind it was largely intuitive. He understood, at some level, that the first priority was to stop the wind. The second priority was to stop the bulk of the cold air infiltration. The third, and this is the detail that distinguished his seal from a merely adequate one, was to create a dead air space between the outside and the interior. The canvas tarp went up first, stretched taut across the mouth of the crevice, and held in place by 4 boards wedged horizontally between the walls at chest height, waist height, knee height, and near the ground. The tarp was not lashed to the boards. It was simply draped over them and tucked, which allowed it to flex under wind pressure rather than fight it. A rigid barrier at that scale would have cracked or torn in the sustained gusts that followed. A flexible one moved, absorbed, and held. Behind the tarp, roughly 14 to 18 inches inside the crevice, measured from the entrance, Marsh stacked the remaining wagon boards vertically, side by side, filling the width of the opening to within a few inches of the top. These boards were not chinked. He didn't have the time or material for it, but he did, according to the account relayed through the Trading Post record, pack the gaps between the boards with one of his wool blankets, torn into strips and pressed into the joints. The result was a 2-layer barrier, an outer membrane of canvas that shed the direct wind load and bulk precipitation, and an inner wall of wood and wool that slowed conductive heat loss and captured a layer of semi-still air between the two surfaces. That air gap, unintentional, roughly 14 inches deep, was doing more thermal work than either barrier alone. Air, when still, is one of the most effective insulating materials in the natural world. It is the principle behind double-pane glass, behind down insulation, behind the layered clothing system that experienced cold weather travelers used long before anyone put the physics into words. A 14-inch column of still air between a canvas membrane and a wooden wool wall has an insulating value that, while impossible to calculate precisely without control conditions, was meaningfully better than either surface in isolation. The floor mattered too. Marsh had laid down the widest wagon boards he could fit across the crevice floor, creating a platform roughly 2 inches above the bare stone. That gap, small as it was, prevented the direct conductive drain of body heat into the rock below. Stone floors in confined spaces are one of the primary causes of cold-related distress in improvised shelters because the conductive loss is invisible. It doesn't feel like wind chill. It doesn't announce itself. It simply draws warmth out of a sleeping body at a rate of somewhere between 25 and 40 watts per square foot of skin contact, depending on the stone type and moisture content. With the floorboards in place, Marsh sat on wood, not rock. The difference, over several hours, was significant. He also made one additional adjustment that accounts suggest was deliberate. He left a gap at the very top of the entrance seal, a space approximately 4 to 6 inches tall, between the top of the board wall and the granite ceiling, open. Not because he forgot to fill it, because he was concerned about smoke. He intended to build a fire. And a fire in an enclosed space without ventilation is not a heater. It is a trap. The top gaps serve as a passive exhaust, a crude but functional chimney effect. Warm, smoke-laden air would rise toward the ceiling and escape through that gap, drawing fresh air in under the bottom edge of the canvas tarp at the outer seal. It was not elegant. It was not efficient in the way a design draft system would be. But it worked well enough to keep the air inside breathable. And that was the difference between a shelter and a tomb. By the time the blizzard was fully established outside, sustained winds estimated at 35 to 45 miles per hour, temperature dropping toward 14 degrees Fahrenheit, visibility near zero. Marsh had a small fire burning at the back of the crevice, his blankets spread over the board floor, his provisions within reach, and a system of stone, wood, canvas, and while doing something that no individual component could have done alone. The mountain was holding heat it had never been asked to hold before, and it was not letting go easily. There's a kind of knowledge that exists before language. Before books, before engineering schools, before anyone sat down to write the laws of thermodynamics into a textbook and give them Latin names. It lives in the hands of a man who has spent enough winters in enough cold places to understand, in his body if not his mind, what keeps heat and what loses it. Eldon Marsh was not an engineer. He had no formal education in physics, no access to the scientific literature being produced in the universities of the Eastern Seaboard in Europe in the 1840s. What he had was experience, and experience in the frontier context was a form of applied thermodynamics that worked even when the practitioner couldn't have explained why. But the why is worth explaining now, because it is the reason his improvised shelter performed so far beyond what its materials should have allowed. The first principle at work inside that crevice was thermal mass, the capacity of a material to absorb and store heat energy before releasing it slowly over time. Different materials have dramatically different thermal mass values. Air, for example, has almost none. It heats quickly and loses heat just as quickly. Wood has moderate thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it at a reasonable rate, which is why a log cabin with thick walls stays warmer longer than a thin-walled frame structure. But stone, particularly granite, has among the highest thermal mass values of any naturally occurring building material. 1 cubic foot of granite weighs approximately 165 pounds and can absorb roughly 0.19 BTUs of heat per pound per degree Fahrenheit. This means that a single cubic foot of granite, heated from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, a rise of just 17 degrees, stores approximately 530 BTUs of heat energy. That is the equivalent of burning about half a pound of dry hardwood. The walls surrounding Marsh, even considering only the rock within 3 feet of the crevice interior on each side, represented a thermal storage capacity in a range of tens of thousands of BTUs, a reservoir that, once even modestly warmed, would release that energy slowly and steadily long after any fire had gone out. This is the fundamental principle behind the Russian masonry stove. The pechka, which burns hot and fast for 2 to 3 hours, heating several tons of brick and stone to temperatures between 150 degrees Fahrenheit and 200 degrees Fahrenheit, then releases that stored energy gradually over the following 18 to 24 hours. Russian peasant families of the 18th and 19th centuries understood this principle empirically long before anyone measured it in a laboratory. They burned less wood than their Western European counterparts and stayed warmer longer, because they were heating mass, not air. Marsh's crevice was a cruder version of the same system. He was not heating the granite walls to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. His small fire could not accomplish that. But he was raising the surface temperature of the rock within his shelter by a meaningful margin, and the granite was holding that marginal gain far more stubbornly than any tent or canvas enclosure could have. The second principle was radiative heat transfer. Warm surfaces, including the body of a man and the walls of a shallow fire, emit infrared radiation in all directions. In an open environment, that radiation disperses into the sky and surrounding air, where it does the occupant no good whatsoever. In a narrow enclosure, the geometry changes the equation entirely. A man sitting in a crevice 30 inches wide is never more than 15 inches from a stone wall. That wall receives his radiated body heat, absorbs a fraction of it, and re-radiates a portion back. The reflected radiation, small as it is on a BTU by BTU basis, adds up over hours. The man is, in a meaningful sense, warming himself with his own heat, not losing it irreversibly to the sky. The third principle was convective circulation. Warm air rises. In an open space, it rises and is immediately replaced by cold air drawn in from the perimeter. In a sealed, narrow enclosure, the rising warm air hits the ceiling almost immediately, transfers heat to the rock, cools slightly, descends along the walls, and returns to the heat source. The loop is short, tight, and relatively efficient. The interior air temperature stabilizes at a higher value than the exterior because the cycle is contained, not constantly flushed. None of this was mysterious. None of it required divine intervention or extraordinary luck. It required a space narrow enough to create that convective loop, walls massive enough to hold the heat the loop delivered, a seal good enough to prevent the outside air from overwhelming the system, and a floor elevated enough to prevent the ground from draining the warmth out of the one living heat source in the entire assembly. Marsh had all four, not by design, by desperation. The distinction, from the perspective of the physics, was irrelevant. The mountain did not care why he had built it correctly. It simply held the heat he gave it and returned it slowly, degree by degree, through the long first night. The fire was small by necessity and large by effect. Marsh had salvaged roughly 40 pounds of usable wood from the wagon frame, scraps, braces, a section of the tongue, several boards from the wagon bed that had cracked during the axle failure. In frontier terms, this was not an abundance. A standard open hearth fire in a log cabin consumed between 20 and 30 pounds of split hardwood per hour under winter conditions to maintain a livable interior temperature. 40 pounds, fed to a conventional fire in a conventional way, would have lasted him 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. He could not afford a conventional fire. What he built instead was something closer to what modern practitioners of traditional heating call a coal fire. A very small, very dense combustion bed designed not to produce maximum flame, but to generate a sustained, concentrated heat source with minimum fuel consumption. The logs, or in this case, the boards, were not stacked loosely to encourage airflow and fast burning. They were placed tight, end to end, with the burning face kept small and the fuel feeding slowly from the back as the front consumed. The geometry of the crevice assisted him in ways he could not have anticipated. A fire needs three things: fuel, oxygen, and a mechanism for removing combustion gases so fresh air can reach the flame. In an open fire, all three are solved by the open environment. Fuel is what you put in, oxygen comes from everywhere, and the smoke simply rises into the sky. In an enclosed space, the third element becomes the critical constraint. Without adequate draft, a reliable flow of fresh air into the combustion zone and spent gases out, the fire smothers itself, fills the space with carbon monoxide, and kills the occupant before the cold does. Marsh had addressed this, as noted, with the gap at the top of his entrance seal. But the crevice itself contributed something he hadn't planned for. Natural rock fissures are not geometrically uniform. The crack that Marsh occupied narrowed as it rose, standard behavior for a fracture line in a granite formation under compressive stress, but it also varied in width along its horizontal length, creating, at certain points, partial constrictions that altered the airflow pattern inside the space. Local accounts relayed much later describe Marsh noting, with some surprise, that the smoke from his fire moved consistently toward the upper entrance gap rather than pooling at ceiling level, which suggested a natural draft was forming, a gentle but persistent movement of air from the lower entrance, across the fire, and up toward the exit gap. This is the chimney effect in its most primitive expression. A column of warm air inside a confined vertical space is less dense than the cold air outside. It rises. As it exits through the top gap, it creates a slight negative pressure at the bottom of the enclosure, which draws fresh, cold outside air in under the bottom of the canvas tarp. That fresh air feeds the fire. The fire produces more warm air. The warm air rises and exits. The cycle sustains itself without any mechanical assistance. No bellows, no forced draft, no manually maintained airflow. The same principle underlies every functional chimney ever built. The height of the column, the temperature differential between interior and exterior air, and the size of the exit opening all determine the strength of the draft. In a masonry fireplace, these parameters are calculated and designed. In Marsh's Crevice, they emerged accidentally from the natural geometry of a fracture line in a granite formation at 8,400 feet. The draft was not powerful. It would not have satisfied any stonemason standards for a hearth. But it was consistent, and consistency was what Marsh needed. A steady, gentle draw kept his small fire burning cleanly, producing heat rather than smoke, and prevented the buildup of carbon monoxide that would otherwise have made the shelter uninhabitable within the first hour. He fed the fire carefully. Experienced accounts from mountain men of the period consistently describe a discipline around fire in enclosed winter shelters. Feed small, feed often, never let the coal bed go cold. A coal bed, the deep layer of glowing embers beneath the active flame, is far more thermally efficient than open flame. It radiates heat steadily and persistently, produces less visible smoke per BTU than active combustion, and can be maintained at a stable temperature with surprisingly small fuel additions once established. By the end of the first full night, Marsh had consumed approximately 18 to 22 pounds of his salvaged wood. He had, by his own later account, expected to use all 40 pounds in the first night and face the second with nothing. Instead, he had 20 pounds remaining. The crevice had changed the equation. Not dramatically, not magically, but measurably, and in the most important direction. He was burning less wood and retaining more heat than any open-air fire or standard canvas shelter would have permitted. Outside, the blizzard built through the night. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind sustained at 35 to 45 miles per hour along the ridgeline, driving the felt temperature well below zero. Snow accumulated at a rate that would, by morning, have buried a man sleeping in the open to his chest. Inside the crevice, the air temperature, impossible to measure precisely, but reconstructible from physiological accounts, held in the range of 38 degrees Fahrenheit to 46 degrees Fahrenheit through the worst hours of the night. Not warm, not comfortable, but survivable with effort. And survival was the only metric that mattered. The blizzard did not stop in the morning. This was the variable that no calculation had prepared him for. Mountain storms in the northern Rockies in late October can be 3-day events. Slow-moving systems that park over a ridgeline and grind through their moisture load at a pace that feels personal, as though the weather is making a considered decision. Experienced travelers of the period acknowledged this possibility and prepared for it. Most, in Marsh's situation, would have prepared by turning back 2 days earlier. He had not turned back, and now the mountain had turned the calendar into a different kind of problem. The second morning arrived not with clearing skies, but with a brief lull, the deceptive pause that sometimes occurs as a storm's first band exhausts itself before the second arrives. Marsh used it. He pushed the tarp aside, stepped out into thigh-deep snow, and assessed. The trail ahead was buried. The trail behind was buried. His mule, remarkably, was alive, still pressed into its rock notch, blanketed by accumulated snow that had, paradoxically, served as insulation. He fed the animal a portion of what remained in the feed bag, noted the sky rebuilding to the northwest, and retreated inside within 20 minutes. The second band hit 2 hours later, harder than the first. It was during the second day that the thermal dynamics of the crevice became most apparent. Not because the system performed dramatically better, but because it revealed its limits with precision. The interior air temperature, which had held in the upper 30s degree F through the first night with regular fire maintenance, dropped noticeably during the hours when Marsh allowed his coal bed to fall too low. Without a consistent heat input, the convective loop slowed. The granite walls, which had been absorbing marginal BTUs and re-radiating them, began to equalize toward the cold exterior temperature rather than the warmer interior. The gap between inside and outside temperatures, which had reached as much as 22 degrees Fahrenheit to 28 degrees Fahrenheit during active fire maintenance, narrowed to perhaps 10 degrees Fahrenheit to 14 degrees Fahrenheit during the lowest periods. This is the critical lesson that experienced users of masonry heating systems learn, often painfully. Thermal mass is not a battery that charges instantly. It requires consistent, sustained heat input over time to build its reservoir. A fire that burns for 3 hours and then dies does not leave a warm room for 12 hours. It leaves a warm room for 2 or 3, followed by a steady return toward ambient temperature. The reserve is proportional to the input. Marsh learned this on the second day. He adjusted his discipline. Rather than allowing the fire to cycle high and low, building it up for warmth and letting it die back to conserve fuel, he maintained the coal bed at a consistent, minimal level. Enough combustion to keep the core temperature above 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Enough radiant output to sustain the convective loop, but not so much as to consume his remaining wood faster than the storm was consuming his patience. The result was measurable. The interior temperature stabilized. It was not generous. Accounts suggest somewhere in the mid-30s degree F at his sleeping level, warmer near the fire, colder near the entrance. But it was stable, and stability in a situation like this is its own form of warmth. A body that is not fighting a declining temperature can direct its metabolic resources toward maintenance rather than recovery. He ate sparingly. He slept in intervals, waking to tend the fire, sleeping again. He kept the wood inventory in his hands, literally stacking and res-tacking the remaining boards, as a way of knowing without calculation how long he could sustain what he had built. The third day brought the storm's final band. Lighter snow, but a sustained wind that drove the cold more efficiently than the heavier precipitation had. The felt temperature outside, by the best reconstruction available, dropped below -10 degrees Fahrenheit during the peak afternoon gusts. Inside the crevice, Marsh maintained his system. He fed the coal bed. He preserved the convective loop. He kept himself off the stone floor. He drank melted snow heated in his tin cup. He ate the last of his jerk meat. And he waited. Oral accounts from the Trading Post note that he later described the third night as the clearest thinking he had experienced during the entire ordeal, not despite the conditions, but partly because of the enforced simplicity of his situation. There was nothing to decide, nothing to plan, nothing to do except manage the one system he had built. The fire, the seal, the floor, the draft. For variables, for decisions, repeated every few hours, through every dark, cold interval. By the morning of the fourth day, the wind had dropped. The sky had not cleared, but the storm's energy had exhausted itself. The temperature outside rose toward the mid-20s degree F. The snow stopped. Marsh had 8 pounds of wood remaining. He had used 32 pounds over 4 nights and 3 full days to maintain a survivable interior temperature in an uninsulated rock fissure at 8,400 feet during one of the harder early-season blizzards on record in that part of the Rockies. A conventional canvas tent, under the same conditions, would have required continuous fire maintenance and consumed his entire 40-pound supply inside the first night, leaving him with nothing for the days that followed. The difference was not luck. It was geometry, mass, and the stubborn physics of stone. The search party left the trading settlement on the morning of the fourth day, when the storm had eased enough to make the trail passable on horseback. There were 4 men. They were experienced. They expected, with the pragmatic honesty of men who had made this kind of search before, to be recovering a body. They brought a horse blanket, a flask of brandy, and rope. They did not bring a stretcher, because a stretcher requires 4 men to carry, and they were already 4 men. In the calculus of frontier rescue, this was a detail that communicated expectation more clearly than anything said aloud. The trail took them most of the morning. The snow was heavy enough to slow the horses to a walk on the upper sections, and the wind had rearranged the drifts in ways that obscured the path in several places. One of the men, a trapper named Caleb Dern who knew that stretch of trail better than any of the others. Led from memory as much as from sight, reading the rock formations rather than the buried ground. They found the mule first. It was standing in its rock notch, alive, snow-crusted and hollow-eyed, but upright, which was itself a surprise. Animals caught in the open in storms of that severity typically succumb to a combination of cold stress and energy depletion within 36 to 48 hours. This one had been sheltered partially by the same granite formation that had sheltered its owner. The notch had blocked the direct wind load. The accumulated snow had acted as an insulating layer over the animal's back. It was not well, but it was alive. Dern noted the mule and looked toward the wall of rock above it. He saw the crevice. He saw the frost-dusted canvas tarp stretched across its mouth. He saw, along the top edge of the seal, a thin thread of smoke rising in the still post-storm air. According to an account recorded much later by one of the other men in the party, Dern stopped his horse, studied the crack in the rock for a long moment, and said nothing. Then he dismounted and walked toward it. He pulled the tarp aside. Marsh was sitting up on his board floor, back against the granite wall, the remains of a small fire reduced to deep orange coals in front of him. He was wearing his coat. His hands were in his lap. He looked, the account suggests, like a man who had been sitting quietly for a long time and had simply run out of things to think about. He was not frostbitten in any significant way. His fingers and toes were intact. His face was wind-burned from his brief excursion on the second morning, but not damaged beyond what a week of mountain travel would have produced under ordinary conditions. The interior of the crevice, when the rescuers pressed close enough to feel it, was noticeably warmer than the outside air. Not dramatically, not the warmth of a cabin or a heated room, but enough that the men noted it. Enough that one of them said, later, that it felt like stepping out of the wind into a barn. A cold barn, but a barn. Dern looked at the board floor. He looked at the canvas and wood entrance seal. He looked at the gap at the top where the smoke had been escaping. He looked at the walls, which had a faint residue of soot on the upper sections where the convective loop had carried the smoke before drafting it out. He looked at Marsh. "How much wood did you use?" he asked. Marsh glanced at the small pile remaining. 8 boards, the largest perhaps 3 feet long. "Roughly 30 pounds over the 4 days," he said, or words to that effect, according to the account. Dern was quiet for a moment. He had spent 30 winters in those mountains. He had built more emergency shelters than he could count, under more adverse conditions than most men would survive once. He knew what 40 pounds of wood could do in a canvas tent in a sustained blizzard at altitude. He knew the math. He had done the math for many men in many post-storm recoveries, and the math had not always ended with the man alive. 30 pounds, he repeated. He looked at the crevice again. The stone walls, the floorboards, the draft gap, the coal bed. He didn't say anything else for a long time. He just stood in the mouth of the crack in a mountain, in the cold post-storm air, looking at what a desperate man with a broken wagon had built without knowing what he was building. What Dern recognized, without the language to name it, was efficiency, not survival by endurance or luck or extraordinary personal toughness. Survival by a system that had done most of the work silently, in the dark, over 4 days, without asking anything of its builder except that he maintain the fire and stay off the stone floor. He had seen cabins, well-built cabins, with seasoned logs and good chinking, that consumed more wood than this in a single night and left their occupants cold by morning. He helped Marsh to his feet, handed him the flask, and said nothing further about what he had found. But the account records that on the ride back to the settlement, Dern stopped twice to look back at the granite face where the crevice opened, once while they were still close enough to see it clearly, and once from the ridgeline, where it was already just a shadow in the rock. He was trying to remember the details. He was already thinking about how it had worked. The crevice is still there. The trading post is gone, and the trail it served has been a footpath for more than a century, unmarked on most modern maps. The granite formation that contains the fissure has not changed in any meaningful way. Granite changes on geological timescales, not human ones. The crack in the rock that sheltered Eldon Marsh for 4 days in October of 1847 is, by any reasonable estimate, indistinguishable from the crack that exists in that formation today. What changed was not the mountain. What changed was what men decided to build and why. The principles that made Marsh's accidental shelter work are not historical curiosities. They are active, governing physical laws that operate in every structure built today, and in most cases are being violated by those structures in ways that would have puzzled any frontier builder who understood cold. The modern residential home in a cold climate is, from a thermal mass perspective, almost aggressively inefficient. It is built primarily from lumber, a material with low thermal mass, moderate insulation value, and a structural lifespan that, in harsh climates, rarely exceeds 80 to 100 years without significant maintenance. It is heated by forced air systems that warm air, not mass, meaning the moment the furnace shuts off, the temperature begins to drop because there is nothing in the walls or floor holding the heat that was just produced. The average American home loses between 25% and 35% of its heating energy through the building envelope, walls, windows, roof, within the first hour after the heating system cycles off. A well-designed masonry structure, by contrast, whether a Russian pechka, a Finnish contraflow heater, a Roman hypocaust, or the accidental earth contact geometry of a granite crevice, retains heat for between 12 and 24 hours after active combustion ends. The mass absorbs the energy when it is available and releases it when it is needed. The system self-regulates, within limits, without mechanical assistance. This is not primitive. This is engineering that modern passive house designers are rediscovering and rebuilding from first principles, calling it thermal mass integration, earth sheltering, or passive solar design, and publishing it in academic journals as though the frontier had never figured it out with broken wagon boards and a folding knife. The irony is not subtle. Caleb Dern spent the winter following Marsh's survival telling the story to anyone who would listen at the trading settlement. Local accounts suggest he added a rock thermal mass shelf to the back wall of his own cabin that winter, a ledge of flat river stone, roughly 18 inches deep and 6 feet wide, positioned behind his iron stove to absorb radiant heat during the burn cycle and release it during the night. It was a crude thermal battery, built by a man who couldn't have defined the term, and it reportedly reduced his firewood consumption by an estimated 20% to 25% compared to previous winters. He had learned something from a crack in a rock that a man crawled into out of desperation. He had taken that something and applied it deliberately, in miniature, to a structure he had lived in for years without understanding how to make it work harder. That is the arc of vernacular engineering. Not invention from nothing, but observation translated into application. The mountain knew how to hold heat. It had always known. The question was whether the men building on it and beside it were paying attention. Marsh paid attention because he had no other option. Dern paid attention because he saw the result and recognized it for what it was. Most people, then and now, walk past the crack in the rock without stopping. The physics operates whether they notice it or not. The granite holds its heat. The convective loop forms in any narrow enclosed space with a warm body or a small fire. The draft establishes itself in any sealed enclosure with a top gap and a bottom inlet. These are not secrets. They're not lost technologies. They are the properties of matter, unchanged since before the first person struck a flint in a stone cavity and wondered why the warmth lasted longer than the flame. What was built in desperation on a Rocky Mountain trail in 1847 was not a miracle. It was a lesson, one that the mountain had been offering to anyone willing to be desperate enough or curious enough to accept it. Some lessons only arrive when everything else breaks. The axle snapped. The sky closed. The man climbed into the rock, and the rock held him. This script is produced for educational and historical storytelling purposes only. It does not constitute engineering, survival, or construction advice. Always consult qualified professionals and follow current safety codes before attempting any construction or wilderness travel.